Hey, welcome to this new API report on a Cisco API this time. Let's use API Insights and dive in a little bit more. Now, we've all heard of Cisco. They do amazing networking products, and one of their latest APIs that I cannot pronounce, but it sounds like Meraki, we'll find out. Their API allows you to manage your network through an API at scale, which mind-blowing, right? So if we have a quick look, we've got a pretty good website here. We've got a Python SDK. You can work with it. You can do network automation, working with guest Wi-Fi, IoT and security. There's so much you could potentially do by having a REST API around a network. So we're going to dive into it a little bit more. Let's come over to the documentation just up the top. And we're going to focus on the dashboard API. I haven't looked at it, but let's see. So it is a RESTful API to programmatically manage and monitor networks at scale. It's got an API reference, got integrated APIs, got some libraries and SDKs. You can use Ansible. Let's look at the authentication. So supports a bearer auth using a standard authorization header parameter. So the value is going to be a string that begins with the word bearer, followed by your API key. Now we've got a JSON example, a curl example, and how you might be able to do that in Python. Pretty cool so far. Obtaining the API key, you open up your dashboard, you go to organization and settings, then you've got to enable access to the dashboard API. Once you've got your key, you can then obviously use that with a Postman collection that you can add it to Postman on. Lots of interesting, useful stuff. Python library, not that interesting at that point, right? So let's look at this API reference. So we're on version 1.41.0. We've got an API, platform, configure, bang, straight in with the kill. We've got what looks like a Swagger UI. We can go organizations, organization action batches, but what we're going to focus on is a different resource. We're going to look at something useful, devices. Let's go look at devices. So get network devices. Now that's quite an interesting one, right? We want to be able to understand what devices are attached to our network. Maybe a more popular use case. So we send a GET request to /networks /the network ID /devices. So yeah, relatively simple. The required parameter is that network ID, which is a string, and you can get responses back. It's giving us an example of a 200 response. Now, we all know I'm very specific about responses. In this case, it's absolutely fine because it's what we would expect. We've got a schema definition and an example body. So let's look at this example body a moment. We've got a name for lat and long, the serial number, the MAC address, the model, the address, any notes, LAN IP, tags, network ID, beacon ID params. Now that's getting into some crazy networking stuff that I don't understand. Firmware, floor plan, details, IMEI. There's so much information that you could potentially get. So I'm just going to say 1, 2, 3, 4. Run. 404 not found. Never mind. So, oops. Okay, it's not giving me any response body. That sucks a little bit. I'd expect a good error message there. Let me just refresh so I can get the next cut. Bang. Cool. So getting network devices. So it's relatively nice. It's quite a useful payload. There might be other ways that you can interact with this. I wouldn't mind being able to see how I can filter and sort and do things on this API, but it looks like it's very basic in terms of API support. What I always like to move on to next is how to claim a network device. So what I'm assuming there is what we're doing is we're creating or registering a new device to the network using the API. So you're claiming your network device, and And what we do is we simply pass over a serial number for the device. Send a post request to network/network ID /devices/claim. Like I've seen in a few APIs recently, it's very action based, and there's a lot more popularity these days around behavioral driven APIs, where your API is less about RESTful resources and more about RESTful access to behavior, and that's quite useful to see. Now obviously we've got to pass in that network ID, and the body that we pass over will be a list of serial numbers, and that would be the serial number for that device that you want to register. Now, Cisco, if anyone can understand status codes and network protocols, surely it would be you. Give me back a status 200 is not acceptable. You're telling me that everything's okay? Have I claimed my network device? Are you going to claim my network device? Come on, give me a little bit of HTTP information here so that I can actually understand it. Otherwise, what's the point, right? Okay, so it's not telling us anything about failures, any rate limiting, nothing around that. It's not telling us any potential failures that we could fall into. There is a bit in the documentation about errors, but I don't think it goes into enough detail around this. Let's go and have a look at errors quickly and make sure. So there are status codes here. As we can see, everything worked. We've got a bad request, incorrect API key, you don't have permissions, something's not found, and you've made too many requests. So if a response code is not specific enough to determine the cause, error messages will be included in the JSON format. For example, errors, VLANs are not enabled for this network. So they do handle it. However, we're not seeing it on the API documentation, which kind of what I would expect to see at this point. If I'm working with an API, I expect to see every potential outcome of how I'm going to interact with this endpoint. I want to see what I get when my validation fails, what I get when I'm talking about a resource that I've made up. I want to see the response that I get when maybe I'm hitting that endpoint way too many times. Give me that information, where I'm looking for it, so that I can keep that context. Now, this is where I'm disappointed. To delete a device or to remove a network device, we do a post request to network/network ID /devices/remove, passing in a payload of serial number for the device I want to remove. Now, am I deleting it or am I removing it? Now, if I'm removing that from the network, but I still want it to be a device that I keep as a resource on my network, kind of makes sense, but it kind of doesn't at the same time. So I'm expecting to understand why I'm making a post request to remove a device from the network. Will that device still be referenced or referenceable? Am I deleting it, or am I just marking it as no longer on this network? That would tell me a lot about how I need to work with this API. Now, it does give us a reasonable status code of 204 no content, which means that, to me, it sounds like it's been deleted, in which case I should be doing a delete request to that specific device, not a behavior-based endpoint where I'm removing it from a network with a post request. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that sounds very much like a proper REST API if we do it that way. But for now, I'll accept it because I don't know enough about the behavior behind their API. I'd like to see it maybe described a little bit better. The descriptions remove a single device. Now, if I'm removing something, to me, that says I'm deleting it, which means I should be doing a delete request. So automatically, if I don't read the documentation, I should think, okay, I want to delete this. Let's go ahead and delete. Oh, why do I need to send a post request? I'm not creating anything. Come on. HTTP, network protocol. Surely, Cisco, you should know about this network protocol because you do networking, right? So far, not awful. It could be worse, right? So let's take this over to API Insights and let's see how well they score. Okay, so let's get at API Insights. Right, so I want to grab my API specification, which I've handily stored on a file over here. If I drag over my Open API Spec, drop that in, that'll take a few seconds because it's quite a big API. There's about, I believe there's between 400 and 600 endpoints on this API. So we've got to do a lot of analysis, got to do a lot of checks on the API itself. And there's 667 endpoints. Mind-blowing. Just to manage a network. So they got a score of D or 68 out of 100. So to understand how we calculate this, we can click on this button here and it will show us. We score everything on an A to F rating, which equates back to a percentage. The higher the percentage, the higher the letter, which means the better the score. So what this is telling us is that we've got a D for design, a D for performance, and a C for security. Now, with them being Cisco, I would definitely expect their security to be pretty high, right? It shows in their report. So let's go through the design. We're failing on consistent pluralization, robust responses, and rate limiting. Now, their documentation itself showed a little bit about how they rate limit and how their responses work, but they're not reflecting that in the Open API specification, which is what I'd expect. Consistent pluralization, as I said earlier, this is more of a behavioral-driven API, so I'm not expecting as much pluralization. And what I've seen a lot in the industry is that action-based behavioral-driven endpoints where you want people to understand the context of the requests they're making. So they have that action-based URI for you to then work with to add that context in the integration. We are passing on versioning, JSON support, HTTP methods, and consistent noun usages. So that is reasonable. That part is pretty good. They've got, 4 out of the 7 tests that have passed. Not a bad effort there, Cisco. Let's now move on to performance. Now, they're not using any CDN, they're not using any compression, and that makes a lot of sense. They provide an API to allow you to manage your network. CDN and compression, that's not something that you care about at this point. You care more about the fact that you can work with the API, that it's secure, that is well designed. CDN, they're not, you don't put your internal network API behind a CDN. You just don't do it. Compression, they could possibly support compression to have slightly faster response times, but not too bad. The load time is already good. They enable cache and HTTP2, which is fantastic. Response size, as I said in previous videos, you can't get the response size off of an API spec and 1 or 2 endpoint requests that we can then calculate things off of. So we do require to use something like Treblle SDK on your application so that we can get a running average of that response size across more than just a couple of bits of information. Obviously, we've got SDKs for most things, so no excuse, Cisco. Why aren't you using us, right? I'd say, realistically, they've passed 3 out of the potential 5 tests that they could pass on. Again, that's not a bad effort there, Cisco. Well done. I'm quite impressed so far. The docs, not so good. Analyzing the spec, slightly better. Let's look at the security now. So, C. We've got a C on the security, which is 73 out of 100, and they've passed 4 of the possible 6. Now, they're not adding any CSP headers. They may not need to, so I'm not going to keep that one too clear in my mind. Iframe embedding, again, this is likely going to be a pretty private API, so the iframe embedding we can kind of forgive as well. They have got good content type options, they've got good strict transport security, they're authorizing all requests, and they've got secure URLs for everything. So I think they've well deserved that C on security, and I'd potentially say they could push that up to a B. Maybe we're being a little bit strict on a few of these things. Maybe we're not. Let us know. As usual, what I like to do with every report that I do is to download it as a PDF. We can save this. I'm going to save it in a Google Drive in my shared folder for Treblle underneath YouTube for this video, and we're going to save it. Now, what I'm going to do is open this up. So we've downloaded our report as a PDF. We can refer back to this at any point. We can understand what was done, when it was done, and all of the information that might be important, such as design, performance, and security. We can refer back to this. We can use this in any of our internal conversations around how we could improve our API. Overall, I'd definitely say there's some room for improvement with this API, especially when it comes to the developer documentation itself. There's a lot more effort that can be put into that. The specification is reasonable, but I think it's more attention to detail that is required to make this API better than what it currently is. If you want to use API Insights on your API, you can go to apiinsights.io or search on the Mac store for API Insights to use our native Mac app to check out your API.